What if you were considered one of the greatest kings in all of Europe? You built the most disciplined army on the continent. You crushed your enemies on the battlefield, again and again. You seized their cities, you seized their lands, you even took their royal title. And yet, you never truly won. In the late 15th century, Matthias Corvinus of Hungary waged one of the most fascinating campaigns in medieval European history, a war he dominated militarily and lost politically. He didn't lose it on the battlefield. He lost it in the corridors of power, in the courts of rival nobles, and in the cold calculations of men who knew that controlling a throne is very different from conquering one. This is the story of a king who had everything except the one thing he wanted most. Stay with me, because the ending is going to surprise you. To understand why this war mattered so much to Matthias, you have to understand where he came from. He wasn't born into a comfortable dynasty with a guaranteed crown waiting for him. He was born in 1443, the son of John Hunyadi, Hungary's greatest military commander, a man who became legendary for holding back the Ottoman tide when the rest of Europe was too fractured to try. When his father died, Matthias was a teenager. When rivals tried to sideline him, to use him as a puppet, he outmaneuvered them. By 1458, at just 14 or 15 years old, he was King of Hungary. And from that moment, Matthias Corvinus set about doing something that almost no medieval ruler managed to pull off. He actually reformed the kingdom he inherited. He centralized power, stripping away the independence of nobles who had grown fat and unaccountable. He overhauled taxation to fund a real treasury. He became one of the great Renaissance patrons of art and learning. His library, the Bibliotheca Corviniana, was among the finest in Europe. But none of it, not the culture, not the reforms, not the diplomacy, is what made other kings fear him. What made them fear him was the Black Army. This was something genuinely new in Europe at the time, a professional standing army. Not feudal levies of reluctant nobles dragging peasants to war for a season. Not mercenaries who'd switch sides for a better offer. These soldiers were trained, disciplined, paid regularly, and loyal, not to Hungarian nobles, but to the crown itself. Matthias had built an instrument of power that almost no other ruler in Europe possessed. Now, he needed somewhere to use it. To the north of Hungary lay the Kingdom of Bohemia. In the mid-1400s, Bohemia was one of those kingdoms that looked powerful on a map but was deeply fractured underneath. Decades earlier, it had been torn apart by the Hussite Wars, a religious conflict that erupted when Jan Hus, a Czech reformer, was burned at the stake by the church. His followers fought back, and what followed was 20 years of brutal, destabilizing warfare. By the 1460s, Bohemia had a king, George of Poděbrady, who had managed to restore some stability. He was a capable ruler, a pragmatist, a man who understood how to navigate a fractured political landscape. But here's the detail that most people never hear about. George of Poděbrady and Matthias Corvinus were not strangers. After Matthias's father, John Hunyadi, died, the young Matthias, barely a teenager, ended up in Prague. He wasn't a prisoner exactly, but he wasn't free either. He was a political pawn in a dangerous game between rival Hungarian factions, and it was George of Poděbrady who took him in. He treated the young Matthias not as a captive, but as a nobleman, with dignity, with respect, with the kind of courtesy that left a mark. He gave him a place at court. He gave him stability at the most vulnerable moment of his young life. He even gave him his daughter. Matthias was betrothed to Catherine of Poděbrady. They married in 1461. For a few years, the two men were not rivals. They were family. Catherine died in 1464, just 3 years into the marriage. And whatever warmth existed between Matthias and George began to cool with her. But the deeper truth is this. When Matthias declared war on Bohemia in 1468, when he publicly branded George a heretic and marched the Black Army northward, he wasn't attacking a stranger. He was attacking the man who had sheltered him as a boy, the man who had called him son-in-law. That's not just history. That's a betrayal, and it raises a question that no chronicle from the time fully answers. Did Matthias ever hesitate? Matthias declared war on Bohemia, but he framed it carefully. This wasn't naked conquest. This was a crusade. With the Pope's blessing, Matthias presented himself as the defender of Catholic Europe against a heretic king. It was one of the most effective pieces of political framing of the entire century. And then, unlike rulers who let strategy drown in ideology, he fought smart. Rather than marching directly on Prague and gambling everything on a single confrontation, Matthias targeted the outer territories of the Bohemian crown, Moravia, Silesia, and Lusatia. These were the wealthy, strategically vital lands surrounding Bohemia's core. Seize them, and you strangle the kingdom. You cut off its resources. You isolate its capital. The Black Army advanced with the kind of systematic, methodical precision that medieval warfare rarely saw. Fortresses fell, supply lines were secured, resistance was crushed not through recklessness, but through overwhelming organization. George of Poděbrady resisted. He was no coward. He held together his internal alliances, used diplomacy to slow the bleeding, and kept his throne. But he couldn't stop Matthias. By 1469, Matthias had done the unthinkable. He had himself crowned King of Bohemia. Think about what that meant for a moment. Two men simultaneously claiming the same crown. One, George of Poděbrady, sitting in Prague, still ruling, still recognized by much of the Czech nobility. The other, Matthias Corvinus, commanding the most powerful army in Central Europe, holding vast chunks of Bohemian territory, and now carrying the royal title itself. It sounds like a paradox, and it was. Because in medieval politics, there's a brutal truth that no amount of battlefield brilliance can override. Controlling the capital is everything. Prague was the symbolic heart of Bohemia. Without it, a king's crown was just a piece of metal. Matthias had the army. He had the momentum. He had the Pope's backing. But he didn't have Prague. And then, just when it seemed like time was on his side, history intervened. In 1471, George of Poděbrady died. This was the moment. The throne was open. The path to full control was finally clear, except it wasn't. Because the Bohemian nobility, rather than surrendering to Matthias, immediately elected a new king. His name was Vladislaus II of the Jagiellonian dynasty. Young, politically flexible, not a great general, not a military genius. But he had something Matthias kept underestimating: the right alliances, the right bloodline, and physical control of Prague. Vladislaus didn't try to defeat Matthias in open battle. That would have been suicidal. Instead, he played the oldest game in medieval politics: endurance. Hold your strongholds, maintain your alliances, let your enemy exhaust himself. Matthias kept winning in the field. Battle after battle, the Black Army proved its dominance. But Vladislaus wouldn't break, and the war dragged on for years. Grinding, expensive, and increasingly frustrating. By 1479, both sides had had enough. The war had bled both kingdoms. Resources were drained, stability was suffering, and neither man could deliver the killing blow. So they negotiated. The Peace of Olomouc divided the spoils. Matthias kept Moravia, Silesia, and Lusatia, rich, valuable territories he had conquered. He retained the title King of Bohemia. But Vladislaus kept Prague. And with Prague, the crown in everything that actually mattered. It was, in the truest sense, a stalemate dressed up as a settlement. Matthias had won more battles than he'd lost. He'd seized more land. He'd proven his army was superior. And yet, he had failed. Not through weakness, not through incompetence, but because political legitimacy, noble loyalty, and the weight of dynastic tradition proved more durable than any army. Matthias Corvinus didn't stop there. In the years that followed, he continued to expand. He pushed into Austria. He captured Vienna itself, something even the great Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, would fail to do a generation later. At his peak, Matthias was arguably the most powerful ruler in Central Europe, but he never went back for the full Bohemian crown. And then, in 1490, he died. Suddenly, without a strong, legitimate heir. The elaborate system he'd built, the reformed finances, the professional army, the centralized power, began to unravel almost immediately. And who stepped in to fill the vacuum? Vladislaus II. The same man Matthias had fought for over a decade, the man he'd outmaneuvered on every battlefield, the man he'd never managed to defeat politically. Vladislaus became King of Hungary. He inherited the kingdom Matthias had spent his life building. The sword had won battle after battle. But in the end, the sword wasn't enough, because crowns aren't ultimately won by armies. They're won by the men who outlast you. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more epic battles, great empires, and untold stories from history.